Merry Christmas, everybody. I'm Tyler, and I'm here to let you know that the George C. Scott A Christmas Carol is no perfect movie. But a lot of Charles Dickens fans believe that this is the best adaptation of A Christmas Carol because of how faithful it is towards the source material and because of how good the performances were, especially George C. Scott. And without question, the best part of this movie, the reason to check it out, is George C. Scott as Ebenezer Scrooge because he's absolutely great. All too often, you get movie adaptations that are based on classic literature like Shakespeare or Charles Dickens, where the acting is good, but it's also so over the top that it doesn't make you feel as if you're watching a movie performance. You feel as if you're watching a stage performance that happens to have movie cameras. George C. Scott doesn't actually have that problem because he never raises his voice in such a sporadic, over the top fashion. He never exaggerates his facial expressions. He surprisingly gives a very dry performance that gives Scrooge this element of confidence towards him. When he has to be an imposing bully and he has to demand Cratchit in the slightest, Cratchit will instantly do anything for him without Scrooge having to raise his voice because Cratchit has definitely seen Scrooge at his worst. But whenever he's being haunted by the ghosts, Scrooge still has this calm and composed attitude that still feels very authentic towards the character, because when he's watching his past actions and how those consequences are being played out in the present, you can definitely tell that he feels very vulnerable and weak. So you get the sense that he's acting disinterested by all this as a means to survive, as a means to stick it up to the ghost saying, "This isn't doing anything to me. Is that the best thing you can do?" But it's also a very subtle approach at showing just how much he's actually thinking about the consequences of his actions and what he can do to redeem himself in the future. Because at the end of the third act, when the Ghost of Christmas Yet to Come has shown him what his future could be, and he has this newfound love of humanity and Christmas, George C. Scott has this surprisingly high level of energy that I had absolutely no idea he had in him. He could jump for joy, he can giggle like he was a little kid, and it was strange knowing the reputation that he had as an actor, but I'm glad I saw that from him. And I gotta say, this movie might actually have the most creepiest ghosts of any Christmas Carol movie ever. Frank Finlay as Jacob Marley, possibly the best performance as Marley, because everything about the character is just nailed perfectly. The huge chains combined with the all gray costume, and the all gray makeup too, that actually makes him look kind of decomposed. That part looked very nice. And Finley himself has this very stilted body posture, but very loud and over the top line delivery that fits the character very nicely. You get the sense that you believe that this character is going through such a deranged state of mind because of the punishment that he's been dealt with in the afterlife. You can see the psychological toll that comes with being forced to roam the earth on end without rest as penance for his crimes. And you do genuinely fear that Scrooge might end up the same way, especially when he's acting disinterested by what the ghosts are trying to show him. Speaking of those particular ghosts, Angela Pleasance and Edward Woodward as the ghosts of Christmas past and present all have one thing in common that make them really stand out acting-wise. They're both really convincing at smiling in such a sadistic fashion as they're doing their jobs. And the most interesting thing is, they don't actually have to manipulate or trick Scrooge in any way. All they're doing is just showing his past actions and the consequences that play out in the present, and they're getting off of the fact that Scrooge really has to really try hard to maintain this calm, composed attitude, because they know for a fact that he can't hold on to it forever, and sure enough, he does drop his guard, and when he does, that's when they get the most out of it in terms of just enjoying the amount of pain that they're inflicting on him, almost as if they have a personal grudge against them and are trying to enact this act of revenge. It was insanely dark and twisted, but I really like that about them as characters. Even David Warner as Bob Cratchit is actually one of the best renditions of Bob Cratchit for one particular reason. A reason that's very similar to the way Mickey Mouse was a great Bob Cratchit in Mickey's Christmas Carol. They're timid and afraid of Scrooge, no doubt, but they still stand up to him without ever having to be confrontational, just by being upstanding citizens, by not being afraid of him whatsoever. And what makes Warner so special as Bob Cratchit is that in his home life, he actually is a very proud and confident individual who takes great pride in the fact that he has a huge family but is still able to provide for him despite the fact that he works very low wages. He's very content with what he has in life, and he wouldn't trade anything for the slightest amount of wealth or prosperity or even being in higher class because he's very comfortable with the life that he has. And you get the sense that Scrooge actually does respect that about him, even when he's trying to pretend as if it means absolutely nothing to him. Now, as good as the performances are, since this is extremely faithful towards the original book, up until the Ghost of Christmas Past comes and starts to show off a more sinister personality towards her, the beginning of the movie up until her introduction felt very boring. It felt cliched. It felt as if there was nothing really new being brought to the table. Because what is so great about A Christmas Carol adaptations is that there's always something different or unique about them. With Mickey's Christmas Carol, it's the fact that they're all Disney characters, but they still fit the Charles Dickens characters flawlessly. With Muppet Christmas Carol, it's a Muppet production that doesn't rely on fourth wall jokes. It relies mostly on them being faithful towards the original text. And with the Robert Zemeckis version, it really does come down to how the motion capture occasionally works in regards to the backgrounds, the camera movements, the sweeping sense of flight that Scrooge goes through with the other ghosts. That was something I forgot to mention in my review of the Zemeckis one. Whenever Scrooge is flying with a ghost, it looks really seamless. It felt like you were on a Disney World ride. With this movie, part of it was probably because of the limitations they could do with a TV movie, because that was the other problem. The production value does look very outdated in regards to the visual effects, in regards to the way that, as much as I say that this is more of a movie than a theatrical performance, they do have to use theatrical stuff like lighting and shadows to kind of hide some of the effects, especially when the Ghost of Christmas Past makes her exit and Scrooge literally puts the cone on top of her to put her out. The lighting and shadows in that were cool, but it wasn't really enough to mask the fact that it was a pretty crappy effect. In fact, watching the George C. Scott one and the Jim Carrey one, it felt like Zemeckis was trying to outdo this one in terms of how dark it was, because this movie occasionally has a horror movie vibe when the ghosts of Christmas Past and Present are showing off their sadistic sides, and of course, with the ghosts of Christmas Yet to Come, it's nothing but dark and horror, but they still balance it out by having scenes with a ton of levity to them. Scenes where we actually do get to examine the relationship between Scrooge and his nephew Fred. That was one thing that very later on in the movie, after Scrooge has finally appreciated humanity, it was something that was explored so beautifully and something that I almost actually teared up at. So there's a lot to really admire about this movie, and that's really what makes it worth sitting through. The acting is all great, especially George C. Scott and Frank Finlay, Angela Pleasance, Edward Woodward, David Warner. They all do great work. And Clive Donner does have good direction with what he's given, but because he wasn't given that much, there are some aspects of the production value and the effects that don't really hold up. And because they're trying so hard to be faithful, there's a lack of surprise in some scenes, especially towards the very beginning. At least the Muppet Christmas Carol actually built up Scrooge's appearance before introducing him through these camera angles that make him seem so tall and imposing. With this one, Scrooge just appears. The camera just cuts to him as if it's no big deal, and yeah, there are some qualities about this movie that are disappointing, but they never overshadow the great aspects of this movie. And for that reason, I'm going to give A Christmas Carol a 3.5 out of 5. Definitely check it out. Guys, thanks as always for watching. If you have seen this version of A Christmas Carol, let me know in the comments below what you thought of it. Be sure to stay tuned for more reviews, and be sure to like and subscribe. Take care.